Do you know the name Eric Liddell? You probably know it. If you don't, he is a famous Olympic champion in the 400-meter race. His life was made famous by the Oscar-winning movie Chariots of Fire, if you know that one. Da-na, you know the big da-na-na-na-na. Okay, well, we don't need to do the soundtrack. It was Eric Liddell who also famously said, "It's not how you begin the race, but how you finish that is important." It's not how you begin the race, but how you finish that is important. Now, I'm going to learn this lesson on a more human level, not so much a spiritual level, but partly that too, in a big way over these next few days. So after church today, there are 2 van loads of people leaving from Victoria. Some are already halfway up the island. And the van loads of people are filled with cyclists and people who support cyclists. So the cyclists are myself, Jordan Rendell, Rick Stark, Michael Sigmund, and a good friend of mine named Dave, who is also here today from the mainland. Then we have support people who are driving the vehicles, and that's going to be Dave's dad, John. And then Melody, Michael, and Eric Stark are driving the other van. And here's what we're doing. We're driving all the way up to Port Hardy this afternoon, and then we are going to do something really crazy. We're going to Port Hardy because it's the most northern point on the island that you can get to with a road bike, not a mountain bike. And then what we're going to do is we're going to ride from Port Hardy all the way down to William Head, which is the farthest south you can get on the island, so Metchosin. So from Port Hardy basically to Victoria, total distance about 510 kilometers. And here's the crazy thing, we're going to try and do this in 2 days. That's the idea. So if you think your pastor needs some sort of psychological examination, talk to the board, they can do that later. But you know those crazy guys. I mean, this is Jordan Rendell, right? Like we're a bunch of crazy people. That's the plan anyways, but in case you haven't noticed, this great summer weather we've been enjoying has completely changed. And now the forecast is for downpours across the entire island for the next few days. So instead of getting a little skinnier when we get back, we might just try all the burgers and fries all the way down the island and just come back and tell you this is the restaurant that you should go to. So to prepare for this, we've been preparing for many months, and one of the ways I tried to prepare for it is when our family was in California over this last month, I did the biggest ride of my entire life. So I rode my bike from Santa Barbara all the way down to San Diego, which is about 400 kilometers, and I did that in one day. And so I got up, I left my house in Santa Barbara at 3:30 in the morning, and I got to San Diego at about 11 o'clock at night. So that was the largest ride that I have ever done in my life. Now, much of this ride was very enjoyable. I mean, you saw the route, right? It's all on the coast, and so I am just enjoying this beautiful California weather. It's sunshine. It wasn't too hot of a day, and pounding surf beside me. So this is the kind of thing that I got to mostly enjoy as I was going along. So you can see, that's just really good times. But then I hit a lot of difficulties as well. For instance, I had 3 flat tires, one of which happened when I ran over a safety pin. That'll do it. That tends to wreck a bike tire. So I've been training quite a bit, so I'm feeling pretty good, all the way up 250 kilometers, 300 kilometers. I'm not doing too bad. I've now reached the farthest I've ever gone in my life, and then the sun set. And being farther south, the sun set at 8 p.m. It's not like up here. It would have been like 10 p.m., which would have been great. But that's not what happens down by San Diego. I still had about 75 kilometers to go, which takes about 3 hours to accomplish. And when the sun set, everything began to fall apart. I was getting pretty tired by this point. Mentally, I completely began to break down. My average pace greatly slowed down, partly just to be safe. I got a bike light and stuff, but it's a little harder when it's dark out. Everything began to break down. And then, of course, wouldn't you know it, around kilometer 370 or so, there was a 3-kilometer long, pretty good grade hill. Now, normally that's not a big deal. I've done a few of those already in the day. That's really not a big deal. But at 370K, in the pitch black, it's no longer along the ocean. Now I'm in like a forest in the middle of nowhere. There's no lights. It was dark. I was totally demoralized at this moment. I tell you, on a 3-kilometer hill, I stopped twice. And I just stood there in the dark. I was like, why am I doing this? And then I thought, well, my wife and my kids are at the finish line. I could just call them right now and they could come pick me up. I mean, 370, no one's going to say you didn't do a good job. But you know what? A few things kept me going. A few things, 2 ideas in particular, made me get back on my bike, get up that hill, and push through. Even at 370, the finish line seemed so far away, even though it's getting closer and closer, but it felt so far away. But 2 ideas kept me going at that point. The first idea was simply this: the sense of satisfaction that I would feel if I actually completed the 400 kilometers and didn't forever have to think I quit at 370. So that sense of satisfaction that I knew on the other side of the finish line, I would feel that. That was the one thought. And then there's another thought that I turned this thought over and over and over in my head from every angle for a good half hour or so, and this thought kept me going. It was the thought of eating a Supreme Pizza from Domino's. So that's exactly what I did. I got to the finish line. I'll never forget, my family was cheering for me. It's in the pitch black in this park in the middle of nowhere. I took a shower in the sprinklers. It was fantastic. And then I was sitting in the van in front of Domino's. As Heather, I couldn't even walk anymore at this point, so she went and got the pizza. I'm sitting in the van. I'm feeling that great sense of satisfaction, and I'm telling you, it was the best pizza I have ever eaten in all my life. Yeah. So delicious. It's not how you start the race, but how you finish that's important. That is what our passage is about today. If you're just joining us, we are working through Paul's second letter to Timothy, and here you heard it. Paul says, I have finished the race. And all through the New Testament, the authors of the New Testament love to use these athletic metaphors. So today's kind of athlete day. Other times we can have like music day, and sometimes we can have arts and crafts day. I don't know if we've done that one or not, but we might get there eventually. Today's like athlete day. That's the metaphor that we've got going on today. One of the other really famous ones, of course, is Hebrews 12, which we'll look at in communion later on, where we talk about the race that God has set out for each of us. That is to say, God has a particular race course for each and every person, a unique course that is for you. In other words, he has things that he wants to accomplish through you, things that only you can do, that your personality, your gifts, people that you need to reach. He has a particular race course for each of us that he has set out in life. But here's the thing. None of our race courses are a simple little 1 kilometer, bike ride around the inner harbor on an electric assist bike. That's like never the way the Bible describes the race that is set before us. No, it's a long race. If you live to 80 or 90 years old, to love Jesus, to battle against your own sin, to serve him, to be faithful in the callings that he's given you, to do that for 80, 90 years, that's a long race. And sometimes, let's just be honest, it gets difficult. Oh yes, the Christian life is filled with joy. Absolutely it is. There are days, there are moments when you are, so to speak, biking along with the pounding surf, beautiful sunshine, and you're just enjoying it all. You got those kind of moments. But then you got the moments where all the lights have gone out. You're feeling demoralized. You're exhausted, and maybe you've stopped on the side of the road and you're just standing there saying, why am I doing this? How do I keep going? And the finish line feels like it's so far away. Those kind of moments also come. And you can feel very discouraged. Oh, how we need to learn to persevere. This was really driven home to me this past week when yet another famous pastor fell away. I know him personally. His name is Joshua Harris. If you've been following the media, written many famous Christian books, very famous Christian pastor. Heather and I got to spend some time, I wouldn't call him my friend per se, but spend some time with him and his wife over dinner and stuff when we were in Vancouver. Got to know them a little, attends my previous church, and announced on Instagram last week that him and his wife are getting a divorce. 2 days later, announced on Instagram that he is no longer a Christian, and everything's just gone from there. It's not how you start the race, but how you finish that's important. That's what this passage is about today. So as we continue to work through Paul's second letter to Timothy, the context here is really important. Once again, here it is. Paul is an old man. He is writing to a middle-aged pastor named Timothy. Timothy is feeling great pressure to quit in his pastoral ministry, maybe even his Christian life. He feels like his personality is ill-suited for what God has called him to. It's overwhelming him. Within the church, he's got all kinds of problem people giving him a lot of grief. He's living in a culture that is not predisposed at all to Christianity. It's where the Temple of Diana was in Ephesus. People are not friendly toward Christians and what they want to talk about. He just feels like quitting. And so I wonder how many of you this morning are kind of feeling the same way. Maybe you started out well in your race with Jesus. You had great sunny days for a long time, but maybe the sun's gone down for a while. Maybe you're feeling very demoralized. Maybe you're like, I don't even know anymore. This whole thing has been very difficult. By the grace of God, I'm praying that today God would meet with you through his word, and he would strengthen you to get back on the bike, so to speak, and to keep pedaling and to finish the race that he has set before you, to finish it with perseverance. I'm praying God would strengthen you this morning. And of course, I'm praying that each of you, this is my heart for you as a pastor, each of you would endure to the end. Because all around us, people are falling away, as Jesus warned us that in the last times people's hearts will grow cold, but that those who endure to the end will be saved. I want a church of people who endure to the end. That's my prayer for you. I pray that regularly. I'm praying today is going to help accomplish that. So Paul writes to Timothy to help him to finish well. There are many things that can be said on the topic of perseverance, but more specifically, more narrowly today, Paul's theme is this: if you want to persevere, you need to look to the example of older and faithful Christians who've gone before you. Older and more faithful Christians, they're ahead of you in the race. You've seen their race, and you need to look to them, and that's one of the ways that you will gain strength that you might endure. And Paul says, as you look at these older and faithful Christians, you got to do three things. First, you got to receive their handoff. Second, remember their perseverance, or remember their race, sorry. And third, rejoice in their reward. So let's work through those three things this morning as we work through this text from 2 Timothy chapter 4. If you put away your Bible, take it out again, make sure you follow along with me. In the first place, Paul says the first thing we got to do if we want to be strengthened to persevere is we got to receive their handoff. Receive their handoff. Here's what I mean. Well, I'm going to show this to you. The older generation needs to hand off the baton to the next generation, and the younger generation has a responsibility to take that baton and to continue to run with perseverance. That's the gist of it. Let me unpack it for you. Let's kind of go deep into it, and then I'll come back to the main theme. So look with me at verse 6. Paul says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come." So remember, Paul is an old man. He is in prison for preaching about Jesus. He knows he is about to die. He's going to be put to death. In fact, you know that this chapter right here, these paragraphs you are reading, are the last known record we have of the writings of the Apostle Paul. For shortly after this, he's going to be released from prison, but he is shortly after this, the ancient historian Eusebius tells us that Paul was beheaded for his faith. So you're reading the final words, if you want to say it that way, the last words we have anyways, that the Apostle Paul ever wrote. And Paul describes his impending death with two images. Let's just unpack these and then we'll come back to the main theme. The first image is a drink offering. Notice he says, I am already being poured out as a drink offering. You got to go back to the Old Testament, Numbers chapter 15 for this. So the drink offering was part of a larger animal sacrifice, and so the animal was being roasted on the altar. There was to be flour mixed with oil to be kind of like a bread that's being baked, so to speak, on the altar. And then there was one final part to the sacrifice, and that was the priest was to take a liter of wine and to pour it out. So basically what you got here is a really great barbecue. The smell of good meat coming up on the thing, smell of fresh bread and a good bottle of Cab Sav or something is being poured out onto the sacrifice. And Numbers 15 says that all of this is, quote, a pleasing aroma for the Lord. So Paul is comparing his life to that. He says, you know, my life, as he says elsewhere, it's a living sacrifice. I've laid my life on the altar for Jesus. I've wanted to use my life for him. And all the stages of this have gone through, and now my life is in the final stage. My life is being poured out like a drink offering. It's the final step of my life as a Lord willing, pleasing aroma to him as I'm coming to the end and my life is about to be poured out. Do you have that heart as well? To come before Jesus and say, first, I'm putting my life on the altar for you. I want it to be a pleasing aroma. I want to go through all the stages of that, so to speak. I want to eventually also have my life poured out, that in my final days I'm still singing your praises and you've used my life for your purposes. Do you have that heart? That's what Paul's saying. The second image of his death is also a very powerful one. Look again at verse 6. He's being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. That word departure is a word it refers to a ship that is being loosed from its mooring on a dock, and it's about now to head out and to sail to wherever it is going. So it's a picture of death. There's many ways that we can view death as Christians. This is one way we can view it, as a departure, as a ship that is sailing toward the great land beyond. That's what Paul is saying here. He's saying because of what Christ has done for us, the Christian need not ever fear death, for Christ has conquered death. He's already forgiven us through his death on the cross. He has conquered death through his resurrection. And so when the Christian comes face to face with death, one way we can view it as simply a departure. We're being loosed from this present life, and we are now sailing into the world where we will meet our Creator. When I think of that, I cannot help but think of the final moments in The Lord of the Rings when Frodo, he's run his course. His course that he had to run, very difficult, filled with suffering, thought he might never make the finish line. He finishes his race, so to speak, and then he gets to sail into the West. And in the story, the West is called the Blessed Realm. It's called the Undying Lands. It's the place where the immortals live. It's a heavenly place. And then we read these words. Then Frodo kissed Merry and Pippin, his best friends, and last of all Sam, and went aboard. And the sails were drawn up, and the wind blew, and slowly the ship slipped away down the long gray firth. And the ship went out into the high sea and passed on into the west, until at last, on a night of rain, Frodo smelled a sweet fragrance on the air, and heard the sound of singing that came over the water. And then it seemed to him that the gray rain curtain turned all to silver glass and was rolled back, and he beheld white shores, and beyond them a far green country under a swift sunrise. How I long for that day when my own ship will be loosed, and I will sail to the lands to see him whom I've always longed and desired to see. This is how Paul describes his death as a drink offering. He's saying, I'm about to die. It's the final stage. My ship is about to depart. But let's come back to the main point. Why is Paul bringing up his impending death? Why is he saying all this? Interesting, but why? Well, I know exactly why he brought it up, and you can know as well by that little word at the beginning of verse 6. What's the first word at the beginning of verse 6? This is the clue. It's the word for. And as I've said to you many times, when you see that little word for, you've got to ask what it's there for. And that's a connecting word. It's saying everything you're writing in verses 6 to 8 is all connected to verses 1 to 5. So 1 to 5 we did last week, and what the gist of it is simply this. In verses 1 to 5, Paul has been charging this middle-aged pastor who feels like quitting. He's having a hard time persevering. He's saying, Timothy, I've given you this charge. You've got to fulfill your responsibilities. God set your race course. Your job is to preach the word. You got to do it whether it's popular or not. You've got to suffer, if that even means suffering. And he finishes with that final little line at the end of verse 5, fulfill your ministry. Or in other words, run the course that God has set out for you. So that is what Paul has been saying. Then verse 6, he's going to now say, for you got to do all this, Timothy, because I am about to die. In other words, what he is saying is, Timothy, you've got to fulfill the calling. Because my time is now done. I'm the older generation. I have preached the word in season and out of season. I have suffered for Christ, but now my time is finished. And so, Timothy, I'm handing the baton to you. You now must carry it. You are the next generation. You got to fulfill it now. I'm giving you the baton, and you need to take it and run. So this passage then is a call to the older generation, and it's a call to the younger generation. You might not be a pastor like Timothy, but God has your own race course. He has things he wants you to do in his service. And the older generation has to pass the baton, and the younger generation has to take it. So let's just have a quick little family conversation, shall we? One of the things I just love about Central Baptist is that we are a multi-generational church. It's actually one of my favorite things about us. We're becoming more and more multi-ethnic. I can't wait till we're even more than that because the food gets better all the time. But we're already getting there. We're on our way, but we are already multi-generational. So here is the great, that's a great thing, but here's the great problem with being a multi-generational church. Everything can collapse in a very short period of time. And here's the way that it typically happens. First, I'm going to speak with the older people, then I'm going to speak with the younger people. The way that it can collapse is if the older people refuse to let go of how things were done in their generation, how it used to be like this, and now everything's changed. The music's not the same as when I grew up. Their people aren't doing the things the same way. And so they hold on, and they become criticizers. And so then it demoralizes the young people, and all the young people leave, and so you get all these churches, and you know them, that are filled with lots of faithful old saints, and the church dies within 10 years. I'm not saying that's where we're at all. I'm just warning us that's the potential of being a multi-generational church. Here's the flip side. And this is where I want us to go, and I think we're already on this track, but this is where we need to be. We need to have our older people saying, all right, at a certain age, you decide when it is. I'm not going to tell you. Certainly not going to pick an age right now. I'll get myself in a lot of trouble. At a certain age, you've got to say, I want to be an encourager for the younger generation. I'll even give up the things, the songs I sang in my youth, I wish we could sing them again because you love them. Whatever you grew up with, it's always your heart language. Of course it is. And you should cherish it your whole life. But of course there's different styles and things change, but at a certain point you've got to say, I want a church that my grandkids will learn about Jesus in. I want a church where my children who are middle-aged can grow up and love Jesus. And of course, you should be concerned for the heartbeat of the church. We talked about that last week. The gospel, preaching the word, those kind of things you got to stand strong on. But some of the forms, some of the outward expressions and things like that, just ask yourself, is the next generation, are they faithfully preaching the gospel? Do you see young people who love Jesus? If so, you got to celebrate and say, that's so great. The forms aren't how I like it. I would choose differently, but I am now going to be a cheerleader. I am going to be an encourager. And many of you older people, you're doing that well already. And so I just want to encourage you to keep doing that. That as a church, you can see we're in a transitional time this next 10, 20 years. So many of you have been faithful over so many decades here. But there's got to be a transition. And listen, the only way that transition happens, first of all, is with the attitudes and with the encouragement of the older generation. So you've got to lead in that, and you've got to hand off the baton at a certain point and say, younger generation, we're behind you. We're going to encourage you. It's not always our favorite, but we're with you. So can you do that? That's my challenge for you as the older generation. Younger generation, again, you decide if you're part of it. You got to take the baton. Because listen, there's an awful lot of younger people who are just living for themselves. And that's what the older generation sometimes rightly complains about is, where are the people who will take the baton? Oh, younger generation, let it not be said of us that we didn't take the baton. Let it not be said of us that we spent all our days just binge watching Netflix and living for ourselves and enjoying all the pleasures of life. No, let it be said of us, we took the baton, we ran with it for our stage of the race, that we sacrificed, that we worked hard. That's what the older generation really wants for us to do. And so if we do it, they'll be encouraging us on as well. It's our time to begin to take it on. So younger generation, here's the thing. Will you take the baton? And that means, it means work. It means difficulties. No race is easy, but will you take it? That's the question. So I think that's how this church will go well into the future. It will continue to be a great multi-generational church if both older and younger can work together on these things and really move it forward. So that's my challenge for us today. Out of what I see Paul saying to Timothy is, Timothy, I'm about to die. It's your turn now. You take the baton. You fulfill your ministry. So that's the first thing. Receive the baton. If we're going to persevere, we just simply have to begin by talking about receiving the baton and actually persevering. There's a second thing. If you want to receive strength to finish well for Jesus, then look to older Christians and remember their perseverance. Remember their perseverance. Look with me now at verse 7. Paul says, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. 3 metaphors, you can see them all there. 3 metaphors, but there is a common thread woven through all of them. Can you see what it would be? What's the common thread? I mean, it's perseverance, it's hardship, it's struggle. None of these things are easy to do, right? Paul has completed them. He's completed the fight. He's completed the race. But the common thing through it all is perseverance through hardship and difficulty. So let's quickly unpack these metaphors. First, he says he's fought the good fight. All this comes from the ancient Olympic Games, basically still the same thing as today. This one particularly from wrestling and from boxing. Paul says he has engaged himself in the one thing that is worth struggling for, worth fighting for, and that is the good news of what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. And he's used his life for that, and he's been beaten, he's been battered for it. It's been difficult as he's gone along to make Jesus known. But Paul is saying, I have fought the good fight. I'm done, is what he's saying. He's like a boxer. He's sitting down. The final round is finished. Not quite given the decision yet. He's sitting in the corner. He's utterly exhausted, but he's satisfied. That's how I want to be as well. When I'm, 80, 90 years old, I don't want to be sitting in the corner saying, I rested all my life, I got lots left. I want to be tired at the end and saying like, oh, I tried, I did my best. I was hard at times, but like at the end of my bike ride, like that was tough. But that sense of satisfaction, I have fought the good fight. And now he's turning to Timothy and he's saying, Timothy, you've seen me finish. Now, Timothy, you're kind of laying down on the mat right now. You need to get up and you need to keep fighting. You're only in round 4. You got a lot of rounds to go. You got to persevere, Timothy. And he used this exact analogy again in 1 Timothy. So we're in 2 Timothy. In 1 Timothy 1 verse 3, he called Timothy not to quit his role, but to stay in Ephesus and to keep serving Jesus. And he said, Timothy, my son, I give you this instruction so that by following them, you may fight the good fight. So in 1 Timothy, he said, you got to do it. Now it's a couple years later. He's saying, all right, Timothy, you still got to keep fighting the good fight. He says, it's been tough for me, but I'm giving it to you. You got to follow in my example. Then the second metaphor. He says, I have run the race. I've finished the race. And Paul's particular race course was clear. He tells us what it was in Acts 20. He says this, I only know that in every city the Holy Spirit warns me that prison and hardships are facing me. However, I consider my life worth nothing to me if only I may finish the race and complete the task the Lord Jesus has given me. Okay, Paul, what was your race? What was the task Jesus gave you? What was your race course? Quote, the task of testifying to the gospel of God's grace. Paul was called by Jesus to go to all the Gentile nations, the non-Jewish nations, and to tell them the good news about Jesus Christ. And Paul is now saying, Timothy, by God's grace, I have finished the race that Jesus gave me. Now, the fact that Paul calls the Christian life a fight and a race should tell you something. It can tell you that, yes, sometimes you're going to feel great and it's going to be lots of fun. And we don't want to downplay the joy at all. But what this is emphasizing right here is that sometimes it can be hard. Boxers get punched in the face. Runners got to dig deep and run really far when their bodies just want to quit on them. It all can be very difficult. And I mean, a lot of Christians are feeling very discouraged. They're saying this whole thing, like they're saying, I'm feeling overwhelmed by my own sin. I've been fighting this for so long. I feel like I'm losing so many times. I'm getting punched in the face a lot. Or just loving Jesus for like so many years and being faithful. It's hard. Is it all worth it? Listen to the words of Jesus himself. Jesus says the gate is wide and the way is easy. There's an easy way to go, Jesus says, if you want to go there. It's got a big wide gate with big signs. It's like a freeway. You can walk down it, super easy. He says that way leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. But Jesus says the gate is narrow and the way is hard. But what does it lead to? It leads to life, and those who find it are few. When you feel like quitting, remember the perseverance of those who've completed the race. And then finally, Paul says he's kept the faith. That is, he's not forsaken God. He's guarded his heart his whole life. He's sought Jesus his whole life. But he's kept the faith. In light of Joshua Harris's announcement and so many other people I know, that's sure what I want to say at the end too. I've kept the faith. The Christian life then is not just simply a 5-kilometer race or something like that. It's more like a marathon. It's more like riding 400 kilometers on your bike. It doesn't do any good to run a marathon for 5 kilometers and then quit. You haven't finished the race. You got to run the whole thing. And so what Paul is saying is we gain strength to keep going and keep running as we remember the perseverance of those who've gone before us, like Paul did for Timothy. Paul's saying, Timothy, look at my life. By God's grace, I managed to do it. By his grace, Timothy, you can do it too. We need these kind of examples. So let me ask you, who are your examples? Who are your heroes in the faith who've gone before you that you can say, oh, that's an example. That can spur me on. So for me, often for me comes back to my family heritage, which is kind of fun for me to look at personally. So for instance, I remember being about 19 years old and I just went by myself. I was in Bible college in Abbotsford and my grandparents on my father's side are both buried in a graveyard there. And so I went out to the cemetery and I just was at their grave and just thinking through their life, and they died when I was fairly young, so I didn't know them super well, but I certainly have heard the stories. And just remember feeling the strength, so to speak, of thinking of their lives and just thinking, I'll follow the same God you followed. Like, I'll fight the fight as well as I can, and I'll run the race as well as I can, and your God is my God, and let's keep this generational thing going. So just being over my grandparents' grave and knowing them fills me with strength. When I find sometimes being a pastor hard or being a preacher hard, then I also remember my family heritage. What's kind of fun for me is that I'm now a 4th-generation preacher on my dad's side. So sometimes I think, well, I look at my dad's own ministry. I look at my grandfather, who was a lay preacher, preached almost every Sunday night in little towns and little churches. And my great-grandfather was a traveling evangelist. So just thinking about that, I think, okay, they did this. Then by God's grace, I can do this as well. Or you think, how do you stay faithful to your wife over decades and decades? Maybe I think of my grandparents on my mom's side. So they got to celebrate their 60th wedding anniversary. So that's one of my favorite things, is being at those kind of anniversaries. Listen, the real heroes in life, the real heroes are not the celebrities from Hollywood. They're not the rich people. You know what the heroes are? It's an old man and an old woman who can barely walk into their 60th wedding anniversary, and they can hardly kiss anymore because, I don't know, they got their false teeth or something makes it difficult. Maybe they don't even kiss anymore. I don't even know. But they can hold hands with their gnarled old hands, and you just think they've been faithful to each other for 60 years. That's an example to the younger generation. Or being intentional to raise your kids to know the Lord and love the Lord. Of course, I think of my own family and my parents, the way they modeled that. And I told you before about my Grandpa Penner and just the way that he would always get out the Bible and pray with the family. Why I love him is that he is the farthest thing from being a pastor. This is my mom's side, not my dad's side. My Grandpa Penner is a shy man and would literally be the last man in this room to ever stand up here or to ever say anything publicly. Not a teacher at all. So I say him as an example to those of you who think, well, I don't know if I can do this. Man, a guy like Grandpa Penner, he'd just read the Bible and read the Daily Bread with no comments and pray. Because I don't know if he didn't have comments or he just didn't, I don't know. But that's the kind of guy he was. The example spurs me on. You see what I'm saying here? When you start to feel like the race is getting too hard, remembering the perseverance of those who've gone before you, their example can spur you on to do it yourself. So here's the thing. I think I have an advantage on this, having this kind of family background. But maybe you're sitting there saying, I don't even have Christians in my family. My dad wasn't a Christian. You're blessed like that. That's good for you. I don't have that. Well, listen. Timothy's father was not a Christian either. You remember early in this series? Timothy did not grow up in a Christian home. Timothy is not a fourth-generation preacher on his dad's side. Timothy's father was not concerned for his soul at all. We saw that his mother and his grandmother were Christians, but not his father. And in those days, the father controlled the religious teaching of the home. So Timothy did not grow up like that. So Timothy found himself a spiritual father in the Apostle Paul. And maybe that's what you need to do as well. Do you have a spiritual father? Do you have spiritual grandparents? Do you have spiritual mentors? People maybe you're not related to by blood, but who you can get to know and you can say, oh, that person, watching their life, I've got to know them. They spur me on. Another quick one for our older and younger generations. I think we can't program this here at Central, but here's what I'd sure love to see if we're going to keep going as a church in this multi-generational thing. Younger people, if you want to have some examples, there's a few white hairs around you. I like the white hair. Don't be offended by that. And maybe some of you older people say, I'm not a great example. Listen, no one's perfect at all. Here's what can happen, though. What if in this church, the older people took it upon themselves to initiate and said to some younger people, hey, how'd you like to get a coffee together? And don't make it anything crazy. Like, don't think, well, we're going to go out and mentor all the young people. Like, just go out and just get to know people. That's what I'm talking about. Younger people, what if you took the initiative? See, initiative coming from both directions, not just one. You took the initiative to say to some older people, hey, how about we go for coffee sometime? How about we have lunch after church sometime? And just get to know one another. I think the mutual sharing of stories, that's where you begin to learn all this stuff. That's where you begin to hear, oh, wow, you went through a divorce when you were 23? I didn't know that. How did you deal with that? Your dad died when you were 25? How did you take care of that? Wow, you've been a member here for 70 years? How do you do that? What if we did that? That's my challenge to you. We can't program that here at Central. But if everybody took the initiative, I think that would make a big difference. I leave it with you for that. Find your own heroes, though. You've got to find some so you can remember their perseverance. That's the second thing. We got one final thing to talk about. We've talked about making sure if we're going to gain strength to persevere, we got to receive their handoff. Second, remember their perseverance. Finally now, rejoice in their reward. If you want to gain strength for yourself, rejoice in the reward of those who have gone before you. Look with me now at verse 8. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. Once again, it's an athletic metaphor from the Olympic Games. When a race was done, just like today, the winners would be brought before the crowd, and then in modern times, we give them a medal. In ancient times, they would put a wreath on their heads. And so you can see the picture of the wreath here, kind of binding together some laurel leaves, some olive leaves, and then they would put it on the head of the victor. And so that was the gold medal, so to speak, in the ancient Olympic Games. Paul is saying here, there is a day coming. Notice the capitalization of day. There is a day, the day coming when Jesus returns, he says, and he, Jesus, the righteous judge, that he's impartial, he's the right judge to judge, he will be able to judge. That judge, he says, is going to reward his faithful people. That's the day when the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel and with the trumpet call of God. That is the day when we read that the Son of Man will come in his glory when all his angels with him, and he will sit on his throne. And on that day, Paul says that Jesus is going to award to Paul the crown of righteousness. Literally it is the crown, namely righteousness. So the crown is righteousness. What do we mean by that? In this life, we are called to pursue righteousness, to pursue a life that's all rightly related to God for the way that we are meant to be. We're commanded to read the Bible, as we saw earlier in 2 Timothy, because it trains us in righteousness. We see that the world right now is in a state of unrighteousness. It's not all rightly related. And so in Galatians 5:5, Paul says this, by faith, we eagerly await through the Spirit the righteousness for which we hope. Or as Peter says, in keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth, the home of righteousness. So to make it plain, here's what I think he's saying. He's saying this crown, this righteousness that we will receive is all that's involved in this new righteous state that God is going to give to all of his faithful people. That is a new heavens and a new earth, where God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. A rightly related place where there's no more death or mourning or crying or pain. For the old order of things, the state of unrighteousness has passed away. The crown is that final perfect state. It's the resurrection body that is immortal. It's the resurrection body that no longer struggles with personal sin, but loves God and loves him purely. It's the final state when this will come true, that the dwelling of God is with people and he will be with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. That is what Paul is saying. Paul is saying, I've run my race. All this is now coming to me on that great day. I'm going to get the reward. But again, let's come back to the main point. Why is Paul saying all this? To strengthen and to motivate Timothy to get back in the race and to keep on running. To enable him to persevere. To enable him to finish well. But here's the big thing. It's not just Timothy. You're in this text as well. Do you know you're in this text? If you love Jesus, you are in this text. Look again at the end of verse 8. Paul is saying for himself there's a crown of righteousness laid up that he'll receive on that day. But notice at the end, not only to me, Paul says, but also to all who have loved his appearing. To anyone who longs for the return of Jesus Christ, longs for his appearing, all of this will also be given as a reward. This word appearing is a word that comes when the emperor would return, say from battle or something, and he would return and people would first see him coming up over the horizon, and the people who love their emperor go out to meet him and to greet him and to welcome him back to his city. They can't wait for his return. So what this is saying then is that we're in this life, and when, like on my bike ride, for instance, you're facing a big hill and all is dark around you and you're standing on the side of the road saying, why am I even doing this? The finish line seems so far away. By faith, you've got to remember the finish line. That's what Paul's focused on here, right? It's what's beyond the finish line. That's what kept me going, was thinking that there's a great stuff beyond that finish line. The sense of satisfaction. I didn't quit being there. And of course, the pizza. That's all there. That's what kept me going. It was faith in the future as I was in the darkness. That's what kept me going. And it's the same thing Paul is saying to us here. And listen, that pizza's not so far from the truth. For on this great day, the scriptures say that all who love Christ will be brought into the wedding supper of the Lamb. It's described as a supper and a wedding supper. I mean, the biggest, most expensive meals you often go to are weddings, especially if someone's really rich and they put on a really great wedding. The kind of meal you eat at a place like that. And so Paul is saying there is this great day coming when we will be at this wedding supper of the Lamb. When we will get to the finish line and we will be there. And Jesus says that people will come from the east and the west and they're going to sit down at those tables. We're going to sit and maybe in the corner you'll have a good 2-hour conversation with Abraham being like, what was with all that weird stuff in your life? Like, what happened there? And Esther, what was it like to stand before the king? But we'll be in the wedding supper of the Lamb. The best pizza in this world is just going to taste like moldy breadcrumbs compared to what's being served there. And of course, all those who loved Christ, who loved his appearing, who've already gone before us, all these examples, many of them that we've talked about, they're going to be there. The great reunion that will be happening in that moment, and of course, he will be there. He who gave his life for us through his blood, who saved us. He who his resurrection brings us through death. He, the groom, will be there, and we will be with him forever. This is what we long for. This is the great hope, and it is this hope which causes us to be strengthened to persevere to the end. Our family just felt this afresh again this summer when we were driving to California. We listened through the audiobooks of a few of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. And so the final book, after the 7 books, it's called The Last Battle. And The Last Battle ends with all the children. They've died in the real world, and now they're in Narnia. And Narnia is this big huge event that happens at the end, and Aslan, the creator and the redeemer of all Narnia, he comes, he brings the children in, and he begins to recreate Narnia. It's a new heavens and a new earth, so to speak. And they begin to go into this world, and the description of their great joy as they see this new world, which is like the old Narnia, but is so much greater. As they begin to experience all the joy of it, you farther and farther into the story, and then after 7 books of trials and tribulations, C.S. Lewis ends the entire series with these final words. Now at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. That is the great hope that we long for. That's what Paul's talking about. That should be pulling us to persevere. So let me ask you today, are you weary? Are you feeling discouraged? Is your heart maybe growing a little cold? Come back to Christ. Come back to Him and look to the example of older and faithful Christians. Receive their handoff. Remember their perseverance. And then rejoice in their reward, because if you love Christ, it's also your reward. It's not how you begin the race. It's how you finish that's important. Let's pray. Father, I pray that you would enable each one here to persevere. Well, what a gift of grace that is from you, for there are so many things that war against us. Our own flesh, which does not love you as it ought to. Our hearts, which are so easily inclined to everything that you are against. The power of the way the world thinks. The power of the evil one, all these forces against us. But Jesus, greater are you, for you have overcome the world. Greater are you, Jesus, for you came to destroy the works of the devil. Greater are you, for you are the one who can conquer our flesh, and in you there is no condemnation for those who are in you. So Jesus, would you carry us? Would you lead us not into temptation? Lead us away from those things that would so easily trip us up. Deliver us from the evil one. Snatch us away when we are so easily going to fall into a pit that he has dug for us. For Father, we are children. We need you, our Father, to guide us. We need you to instruct us, for we are weak. We are not smart. We are not wise. But Father, you are great. You are the all-wise God. You are the Father who cares for his children. So would you lead each one here this morning to persevere to the end? We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.